Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today we will look, of course, at the cabinet shuffle, what's going on in Ottawa, what it all signals about what the new Prime Minister's priorities may be, a little bit of a look back at the election, and of course the Canada-US relationship. We are doing kind of a two-part program this week. We're going to talk with James Moore in one podcast, and then in a separate podcast that we'll probably put up tomorrow, we're going to talk with Cliff Young from Ipsos in Washington, because, of course, as you know, the president is flying around the world and striking all sorts of deals. So we're trying to separate it out a bit because there's just too darn much news. So let's go to James Moore. He is a public policy advisor at the global firm Edelman, also serves on many boards. And of course, you know him because he served as Canada's Minister of Industry, Canadian Heritage, Official Languages, Secretary of State for the Asia Pacific Gateway, was in charge of the Olympics, all under Stephen Harper, and spent 15 years as a member of Parliament. So welcome. It's great to see you.
It's great to be with you, Senator. It's been a while, and it's fantastic to see you. I'm glad to see you merging your two great accomplishments: public policy inside, and then communicating to Canadians about big, complicated issues that bring us together. So, or divide us sometimes. But it's great to be with you.
It is important. We started this during COVID as a way to communicate, right? And it just makes sense to just keep on going with this. So let us start with the cabinet minister. You've been there. You've been in that room with your hand on the Bible and all of the excitement and the pressure and the tension. What are you reading from the appointments and the kind of people who are being appointed to specific cabinet posts?
Well, I'm looking at the list and just trying to sort of draw it all in. I mean, a lot of the people are brand new, so I don't know them at all. So I'll be getting to know them. Right. But it's funny, in thinking about that, I think that's the process. Because if you look at half the cabinet, half of them are people that you don't know, I don't know, none of us really know. We've kind of maybe heard their names through the campaign, or we heard that they might be a decent candidate selection and all that for cabinet. And so all of us are going. But the thing is, it's almost cathartic, right? Like going through the process of searching their name and looking at their bio. Each time you do that, it's what I think the government wants us to do, is realize that, it must be a new government because we have to figure out who these people are. So therefore, it's new, right? Yeah. So there's almost kind of a process that reaffirms the message of this cabinet swearing in, that this is not a fourth Liberal government. This is a first Carney government.
Well, and signals like Wayne Long being appointed, he was the first guy to sort of bell the Trudeau cat and say, look, it's time to move on. And he has now been rewarded. Tim Hodgson, a guy from Goldman and a former Bank of Canada advisor, now taking on that, the energy. These are they are signals.
They are signals, and even things like Joel Lightbound now being the Minister of basically Public Works, and so there's somebody who was highly regarded, who was a good performer in Parliament and all that, but now he's elevated. So somebody who is who hit a ceiling with Justin Trudeau, but people regarded, now under a Carney government, they get a little bit more room to deliver on public policy. But Tim Hodgson is big, dropping Jonathan Wilkinson from North Vancouver out here where I am in British Columbia, bringing in Tim Hodgson is somebody who is a really substantive, really thoughtful person who was a deputy at the Bank of Canada with Prime Minister Carney, worked at Goldman Sachs as well. So there's somebody with real private sector experience. So better than Stephen Guilbeault, probably better than Jonathan Wilkinson. If you're someone who aspires to see economic growth, access to foreign markets, and development of our resources and all that, I think that's definitely a positive step.
So just Wilkinson out, and these were some of the, quote, demands, or what we've heard from prairie premiers, which is, you can't put these guys across the table from us if you really mean what you say, that we're going to try and build baby build or do some development. Guilbeault stays in Canadian identity, culture, official languages, sort of the heritage portfolio. You were there. But he was the guy that was involved from the get-go on Bill C-11 and C-18 and all the constraints on the internet and as many people see it, on free speech. So that's still a hot button.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite hold the same view on all those bits of legislation, but we'll see. But maybe he'll take a fresh bite at the apple and take a new run at it. He'll be sort of colliding as well with Evan Solomon, who's the Minister of Artificial Intelligence and modernization and all that. But and I think Evan probably has a different view.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Evan Solomon, is a thoughtful person, but he worked at G Zero Media out of New York. He worked in private sector media in the United States. He also worked at CTV, private sector media. He also worked at CBC, public sector media.
Yeah.
So I think there's somebody who's going to be around the cabinet table, unlike Stephen Guilbeault, who actually worked in media in sort of a private sector startup and the public broadcaster, who might have a little bit more of a mixed view. And I imagine that his portfolio will be within the Department of Industry, which is one of the big regulators with regard to broadcast policy and CRTC, et cetera. So that maybe there's a little bit more balance there and a bit of a different approach, but certainly more voices around the table.
And worked with the Prime Minister's wife and with Jerry Butts at this Eurasia group under which G0 falls. So connected to the Prime Minister for sure.
Yeah, and obviously well regarded by the Prime Minister. So
Yeah.
anyway, again, a little bit different, and we'll see. I don't know Julie de Bruzen very well, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, which is the other portfolio that I think a lot of Westerners are anxious about. But again, but she'll be given a fresh shot at it. She doesn't seem to come with a lot of baggage. That's a positive thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah. But from downtown Toronto, which, as you know, always kind of sets off people's views. I've been reading all of the things that you wrote during and post the election. You did a lot of work on air as well as bringing the conservative perspective. And there was this kind of Pollyanna a sign from you, this purveyor of positivity, that I guess you're the pragmatic partisan, if I could put it that way. Are you genuinely optimistic? Are you saying, let's just give it a shot and a chance and see, and if we have to change our minds in a couple of months or weeks, we will?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally an optimist for a whole bunch of reasons. And by the way, what other choice do we have? Like, let's get on with it. Let's try, right?
True enough.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and look, Mark Carney, as you say, I'm a lifelong conservative, but I've known Mark Carney for well over 20 years. I got to know him very well after the '08 global recession when we came back to Ottawa. Right after that, so election days are always on Monday. On Wednesday morning after that election, because the bottom fell out of the global economy right in the middle of the writ period of that campaign. I was in cabinet, and we came back, and Prime Minister Harper had us all come back, and we walked into the cabinet room, and there was Mark Carney, and he gave us a briefing on the global dynamics of what was happening with the economy, and then Jim Flaherty gave a presentation on sort of the fiscal tools that were at our disposal to try to combat this, and the G20 finance ministers were meeting, and they'd committed to spend, I believe it was 6% of GDP in the first 2 years in order to try to spur the economy. And Stephen Harper, and I just remember, seeing these three people there who were really impressive, and I felt very reassured as a Canadian that we had some really smart, thoughtful people. But and Mark Carney, impressed Jim Flaherty enough that Jim Flaherty recommended him to Stephen Harper to be the governor of the Bank of Canada. And as governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney impressed Stephen Harper enough that Stephen Harper asked him to be his finance minister. Stephen Harper, an economist and a conservative, I don't think he offers that position to somebody who is, completely off the reservation, right? So now Mark Carney has said other things, done other things, and he has a more, sort of progressive view on a lot of things, particularly climate change and all that. We'll see how that sort of meets with reality now that he's prime minister. But I was pretty I wouldn't say optimistic, but I was kind of relieved, at least in the election campaign, that whether it was going to be Prime Minister Poilievre or Prime Minister Carney, that the Justin Trudeau era was over, like over. Yeah. And now, in the fullness of time, we'll see what Prime Minister Carney does with the fullness of agenda and how much he sort of decouples the next couple of years from the past 10 years. Obviously I have some doubts about that, but Canadians voted for a Liberal government led by Mark Carney. We'll see if it's more of a Mark Carney government or more of a Liberal government, and that'll present itself in the fullness of time.
I'm interested in your take, and we'll keep going backwards for a few more minutes, but the meeting in the Oval Office, sort of elbows up replaced by thumbs up. This is a man who said, this is the end of our relationship as we know it. They want to break us so they can own us. And the first words out of his mouth to President Trump were, "You are a transformational guy." President, and very friendly. So we all know that you can't go into a room with Donald Trump guns loaded, or you're going to lose. But how did you assess that session?
I mean, look, the heat of the rhetoric and the language of the rhetoric versus what you do face to face. It's one of the reasons why you have face to face meetings, to kind of dial down the rhetoric on the other side. Right. But I thought Prime Minister Carney's use of language was almost kind of a little bit tongue in cheek. You've been a transformational president.
No
True.
question about that.
So I think the audience can hear what they want to hear with that, that terminology. But look, overall, I thought he did extraordinarily well. I mean, you see the cruel, brutish, and irresponsible approach that Donald Trump took with terms of his approach to President Zelensky, and that's one thing. There's a lot to be said negative about sort of this 6-month holiday in a time of economic crisis that we've had to endure it because of Justin Trudeau's planned exit from public life, and haven't had a parliament over 6 months, which is an absurdity, but it's what it is. To now, when one of the silver lining, maybe Mr. Brightside, to your point about my column, right, is that maybe one of the good things about that is we have a little bit of now market data and sort of diplomatic market data about maybe what works, what doesn't work. We saw what Keir Starmer did, we saw what Ireland did, we saw what happened to President Zelensky, and so maybe we have a little bit of a guideposts in front of us in terms of how to approach these things. But overall, clearly, I mean. And you never know how these things go, and you never know how long it's going to last, because by this afternoon, everything could be different. But I thought Prime Minister Carney did very, very well, and you can clearly see that President Trump, in terms of his body language, his demeanor, and all that, in that moment, has respect for Mr. Carney, and I think that's good for the country.
So, what about the more substantive side of it, which is President Trump seemed to suggest that the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0 or 3.0, whichever it is, was fine by him. And then the tariffs were going to be there. When asked directly whether there was anything Mr. Carney could say or do, he said, "Nope, that's just the way it is." So how do you read all this on the substance side?
Well, I mean, I'll say what I'm going to say, but the day is young, so it might change this
Yes,
afternoon. Right?
I agree. I agree. He's over in
Saudi
Arabia. He's doing deals, whatever.
Yeah, right. And so, look, we do have the USMCA, or the CUSMA agreement, which is still there. It's still enforced. It's still a reality. It still is the legally binding document that allows us access to the U.S. economy. But now tariffs have been layered on it, which are a direct contradiction of the agreement. So there's sort of three silos of tariffs that have been brought in. There's the fentanyl tariffs. There's the universal tariff. Then there's steel and aluminum industries, the 232 tariffs that have been brought in. So Canada has to sort of navigate these things, and we have to play the long game. As we found out in Trump 45, his first term as president, that he brought in the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs in the middle of the negotiations of the new CUSMA agreement. And so it's entirely possible that, for example, if for some reason lightning struck and we had a modified CUSMA agreement that President Trump decided this afternoon is a phenomenal new agreement that's been properly modified that will serve the American economy perfectly, there's nothing to say that in the next 3.5 years that he wouldn't impose new tariffs randomly because he wanted to, or he had a peak of frustration about a certain thing, or Stephen Miller or somebody in his administration got into his brain and told him that he needed to do this for whatever reason. So this is the election of Donald Trump has a very long tail, and we have to be prepared for the long game and the long dynamic. This is a president who is erratic and all that. The fact that he came back to the agreement, at least in the immediate term, is a good sign. I mean, the CUSMA, we've been cruising along now for more than a generation with the most successful trade agreement in the history of the world that has built the most. Right. And, the North American platform is the most successful economic partnership and relationship and wealth generating partnership in the history of the world. And it has worked. Donald Trump gets elected in 2016 and says, I want to change it. OK, You asked for this. You wanted to change it. We went into about 2 years of negotiations, and we have a new agreement that you negotiated, that you signed, that you agreed to. Here we go. And then he comes back as Trump 47 and he imposes a bunch of tariffs that are a direct contradiction to his own agreement. At some point, he has to come back to his agreement and recognize that that there were some wins for America and some for Canada and some softenings that I would prefer not be there. But this is an agreement that we live by, that he agreed, that he said was the best trade deal ever. So the problem that we have is a lack of clarity from him on what his North Star is. Like what is it? What is his actual achievement that he's trying to get at? And if it's a better balance of trade, that's not really something that you can pull the levers on. And by the way, the United States has a massive trade surplus with Canada if you include trades and services, which is going to only go up over time as we deal with artificial intelligence and other things. So it's kind of hard to know exactly. Like, does he just want Oshawa to shut down and GM to entirely abandon Canada? Would that be the sort of feather in the cap that he wants? Does he want Ford to abandon Oakville and just completely go into the United States and have no auto production in Canada? I mean, it's not going to happen. But is that what he needs in order to say that he's been a tough guy for America? Until we have clarity about that, and I don't know that he's clear in his own head about what he would deem a success.
But do you agree that what he seems to, I mean, every once in a while you get these other things like he wants to pay down the deficit or this or that. But basically he says post-COVID, I want to repatriate all of these industries back to the US. We want to do it. We don't need the cheap stuff from China to put in Walmart. To Canada, we don't need your cars. We don't need your oil and gas. We got all that stuff ourselves. We're just going to bring it home and create jobs. So that's his overall frame. So he might well be thinking, I just want to take the entire auto industry back, and you do what you want on energy up there. Don't care.
Yeah, and it's a fairy tale, and it doesn't work. But if that's what he wants to pursue, the question is, does he need to see lines on a graph in the long term that show a tectonic realignment? Well, that's going to take 10 or 20 years, and he's not going to be president that long. Or does he need some totemic victories that he can point to and say, hey, look, that happened, therefore I'm a success. And if he has some totemic victories, is that good enough so that he can say that he did the right thing? Then we'll see. And then in 2028, we'll see what J.D. Vance or the Democratic Party or whoever does in terms of modernizing this version of Donald Trump. But what he's doing is economic suicide and failure. It does not work. It does not make sense. It's a romantic notion that is not based in any kind of economic reality as we've known for the past 200 years of human interaction economically. So what he wants cannot be achieved and would be ruinous to the American experience.
Okay, let's just drill down because on the energy question for a moment, because it is true that the Americans are pretty much self-sustaining, and what they need and get from us, they could get from anybody else. I mean, he's in Saudi Arabia, he's going to Qatar. There's lots of places that he can get energy from in larger quantities. We're close, we're cleaner, we're all of those things. But if he pursues that, then what does that mean for us? We can't leave our oil and gas in the ground. It just pays for too many things. The contribution to the GDP is just too powerful. But if we're going to make it valuable, it has to be able to get somewhere to other customers.
Well, yeah, and that's why, so going back to where we started, right? So you have Gregor Robertson now in cabinet. Now he's the Minister of Housing and all that. But Gregor Robertson, as mayor of Vancouver over 3 terms, like he had on his, I remember his campaign website, like a tanker ban, mandated across the province. Like if people think that Stephen Guilbeault has been aggressive, wait until you see what Gregor Robertson has said historically, right? And so if we're going to get to Tidewaters in British Columbia, there's a guy who's elected now, and he's now sitting in the cabinet in a big portfolio, who you're running to be mayor of Vancouver. You got a lot to talk about in Vancouver, right? We have infrastructure needs, we have public health needs, we have parks, we have the usual stuff, garbage pickup, all the usual stuff that comes with one of the biggest cities in North America, in Vancouver. And he ran explicitly on, I need to become mayor of the city of Vancouver in order to stop any expansion of tankers in my province. Yeah. All right, so that guy's now at the cabinet table. So, so that needs to be reconciled with Prime Minister Carney and Tim Hodgson and others around the table. François-Philippe Champagne staying at finance, and their rhetoric. And something has to give. This is a zero-sum game. Either you believe in getting Canadian products to global markets, or you don't. And so we'll see. I mean, but the first thing is first is we have to get the economics of this correct, right? Pierre Poilievre in the campaign had perfectly reasonable approach that was based in consultation with the energy sector and with those who actually understand how to attract the capital, how to engage the capital, and then how to actually build projects and what it actually looks like, so that we are tax competitive, regulatorily reasonable, engaged in economic in indigenous really reconciliation for economic development. Like all these pieces have to come together at the right moments and the right time in order to create the environment so that somebody might come in. It's not as though we have 50, pipeline projects that are ready to launch. Right. We don't have any. And so you have to create the environment and the opportunity for somebody to come in and make it rational to get these products to global markets. And we are not anywhere near that. And so
no, and a veto reinforced in the province of Quebec. The Prime Minister said, "I will always respect your right to say no."
Yeah, and so I wonder if there is, and again, this is a very high level, but if there is not a grand bargain that can be made in the interest of Canada, which is to say to the province of Quebec, we will never impose a pipeline on the province of Quebec unless the Quebec government wants it. However, in exchange for that, we will be getting Canadian products to tidewaters elsewhere in the country, and you will not get in our way. You get what you get and you want, and they're going to get what they need and they want. These two things have to happen at the same time if this country is going to move forward.
And I think what would that be? How do you get around it?
Well, I mean, you sort of hands off the province of Quebec, and you have a relationship with Quebec about what energy would look like going to the easternmost parts of this country. But in terms of getting access to global markets in the West, whether you push north, extend our relationship with the Americans to the south, or get to the West Coast ports, you get more aggressive and you lean in and you make something happen. Among the people who were elected to Parliament, right, is up in northern British Columbia, that represents almost 50% of the British Columbia coastline, is a guy named Ellis Ross. And I think Ellis, and maybe you should have him on your show. Yep. He's the former, elected chief of the Haisla Nation on the west coast of British Columbia, who is a conservative, who's pro LNG, pro growth, pro development, pro pipeline, pro getting Canadian markets to global global opportunities. So there are people who are in British Columbia who want to get things done and who understand the bridges that need to be built in order to get things done. So I think that there are relationships that can be built here in order to move these projects forward, and I'm hopeful, again, because what other choice do we have, that Prime Minister Carney will be rational about these things and recognize that he has an obligation to build a country here.
Yeah, which as you say, the rhetoric is there. So let me come, because I'm sure you've read the polls in the last few days too about and I do try to explain the differences to my friends that don't live in the prairies in the West. You're on the other side. That there's a difference between Western separation, the sentiment around that, and Western alienation, and just feeling we're disconnected to this country. I'm wondering whether. I mean, I know you've got your approach, you've got your keep calm and carry on and let's see what happens. But we're also seeing pressure on people like Danielle Smith to get these referendums underway, to get the questions written, to really push this. And we know the politics in Alberta are unique. Ask Jason Kenney, lost his job over this, and she's pretty much in the same position. So, we're also dealing with that, and I guess what troubles me more is the alienation, the disconnect, than the actual separatist sentiment, which I think is still relatively small, or maybe around a third.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be very careful with and you were, but we have to be very careful with the language that we choose around these things, and that's why you're delicate, because I think it matters, right? When people say the West, not quite, right? Like we have.
Prairies.
And even there, right? Like we have an NDP government in the province of Manitoba. They're part of the West. There's no separatist movement there. In British Columbia, we have an NDP government. There's no separatist movement here. I mean, there's a few people who are, but I mean, in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, in all four of the most Western provinces, the Liberals got more votes in this election than they did in the previous two. So,
exactly.
is there a reason for now those who didn't vote for them, which is still the plurality? Is there a reason for discontent? Absolutely. Is there a reason to be frustrated? For sure. Because it's not just that your projects aren't moving forward. It's not just that you don't feel at home with the incumbent government, but it's that the incumbent government gets elected because they confront you, disrespect you, and treat you poorly within Confederation. That wouldn't be tolerated in other parts of the country, and the West is right to have its back up and expect better. And so, Mark Carney has, again, said the right things, but, in the fullness of time, we need to see some deliverables on how he plans to sort of build those bridges and reconcile all of that. One thing about the campaign, sort of again, my Mr. Brightside perspective on this is that if you think about literally in the past 4 months, we've gone from Pierre Poilievre at 45% of the vote and the Liberals at 20%, to the Liberals at 43% of the vote and the Conservatives at 41% of the vote, to the NDP having, what is it, over 25 seats or whatever it was in the previous Parliament, now down to 7 seats in Parliament, and a big chunk of NDP voters going to the Liberals, but also a lot of NDP voters going Conservative in blue-collar, suburban and rural ridings and electing a lot of Conservatives. Most of the ridings that the NDP lost, they actually lost to Conservatives, but voters in other parts of the riding, urban and suburban, folded and went to the Liberals and got them majorities and held back the Conservatives in spite of their growth in suburban Canada. So all of that is to say that literally more than 1 out of 3 Canadians have changed their political affiliation. Yeah. They've gone from, well, I like Pierre Poilievre because I can't stand Justin Trudeau and I really want change, and I really don't want to vote Liberal, but Mark Carney seems interesting, but well, I don't know, maybe he's not quite change enough, and then I'm a traditional NDP voter and I'm going to vote maybe Liberal, but you know what, I don't really like Liberals. Maybe Pierre Poilievre seems like an interesting guy, new generation of leaders, but more than a third of Canadians have floated around between these three political parties. For sure. That's not the sign of a deeply divided country. That's not the sign of people, frankly, like the United States, where you have 48% of people who are Republican, 48% who are Democrats, and political parties are an extension of their soul and their identity and their sense of justice and purpose and fighting for what they believe in. We actually in Canada have a healthy understanding of what political parties are and who leaders are, which are transactional figures and vehicles in order to achieve remedies to problems that are in front of us right now. That's a good thing, and I think we should be reassured by that Canadians are struggling to find the right answers to today's problems with the group of people who are in front of us right now. That's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. That's better.
Yeah, I think you put it well. I was reading one of the things here. We have a lot to agree and disagree with, but in terms of, and I'm quoting you here, character, capacity, and substance, we had 2 honorable choices in this country during the course of the campaign, which is rare these days in the Western world.
Well, we gripe about what is, but we often should pause and think about what might have been. Yeah. Imagine if Justin Trudeau stuck around and he dialed up the rhetoric to 10 and he ran against Donald Trump. And imagine if Justin Trudeau was elected to a 4th term, 3rd in a row, where he lost the popular vote again, but he got imagine where we would be right now in terms of Western alienation and separatism and all that. We've avoided that. And we have a prime minister who is saying the right things for the most part and pledging an open door. He has roots in Alberta. Stephen Guilbeault is not in the key portfolio. It's funny, as conservatives, we bark a lot, and sometimes you need to stop. Say, we demanded that the consumer carbon tax be gone. It's gone. We demanded that the changes in the increase in the capital gains tax be gone. They're gone. We've demanded that Stephen Guilbeault not be near the environment or climate change portfolios. Gone. We demanded that Jonathan Wilkinson be gone. Gone. We demanded that the prime minister promise to beat down internal barriers to trade. He says he will. We demanded that he would meet with Western premiers to get to one project, one review. He says he will. Okay, let's take victories for what they are, right?
Let's say yes.
Yeah, and it's I'm sure there's plenty that he's going to do that's going to frustrate you and me and those of us who are based in the West, and we'll have our disappointments. And he did write a book on climate change that is alarming and people are a little bit cautious about. But he took the Liberal Party that for a decade, all these men and women in the Liberal caucus said that if you don't believe in a price on climate, that you're not a real Canadian, you don't care about the environment. And he took a bunch of Liberals who literally for the past 6-12 months have been saying that the changes to the capital gains tax inclusion rate is really critical because it creates a just society where we get the money that we need in order to build housing and all that. He got them all to flip 180 degrees against what they believed for a decade and push them in a different direction so that they could save their seats. All right, there's a lot of cynicism in there, but they did it, right? So let's try to find victories where we can find victories. And not everything's going to be a touchdown in a Super Bowl, but we're going to
Right.
get first downs and we're going to get field goals and accept them for what they are when you see them.
All those things you said, I actually agree with 100%. Bill 69 still in place.
Yeah.
48 still in place. Emissions cap still in place, which really affects the agriculture sector profoundly. Everybody thinks it's about oil and gas, but this is about farmers and how much fertilizer they use and what comes out of them. It's got a profound effect here. And I don't know, I read every word of the 500 pages of the book Values, and he is firmly committed to net zero. And that is going to come at a huge price. We see the EV industry kind of in trouble here, but he hasn't changed the mandate that we're all going to be driving different kind of cars, and you will be forbidden from having any, traditionally
Yeah.
oil-powered or gas-powered car.
Well, when we talk about 69, 48, net zero, and all these things, these are big pieces of public policy. And quite frankly, I think the pivot on these things and the re-rationalization, for lack of a more diplomatic word, of his approach in the past is less challenging than what he just did on carbon tax and on capital gains, right? So I think not all of it is going to be achieved. He is a liberal. He's not a conservative. The conservatives didn't win. So, however, I think that some of those things he might be prepared to take a look at and to sort of slow down. And even things like, the EV mandates. All new cars bought by 2035 must be EVs. Come on now. Like that doesn't make that really like what if you say, EVs and hybrids, phase it in and move the goalposts back. Like EVs are great if they're small and they're light and you live in Vancouver and you're commuting to and from work.
Not in Saskatchewan.
But low end torque in an EV in the snow and ice does not make a lot of sense. And the range anxiety when it's minus 20, minus 30 is a real thing. And we don't have the infrastructure. Like this is not a rational or practical thing to do. So I'm hopeful that again he will sit down and cooler heads will prevail. He'll have to give the left wing base of the Liberal Party something different in order to chew on and be satiated with. I don't know what that is, but when it comes to climate change and the environment, Canadians believe that we should do something, but we shouldn't do stuff that's economically suicidal. Right. I think Canadians are pragmatic about that.
Okay, I want to come back to your party specifically, and just because our discussion about the state of mind in Alberta particularly, but also here in Saskatchewan, it's pretty powerful at this point. Don't want to overstate it, but that disaffection that I talk about is what's troubling. Pierre Poilievre loses his seat in Ontario. He is offered one in Alberta in the heart of separation country, not alienation country, not we wish we would have really won. It seems a risky move.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I have to admit, for a bunch of reasons. Yeah, it's on paper a very safe seat.
Yeah. It's safe. Just, yeah.
yeah, but it may be a little too. I don't know.
Yeah.
But look, it was offered. He accepted it. I don't know what. I mean, I'm sure a book will be written about the dynamic of how to approach this and the delicacy and the need to get it done quickly. And all that, so that he can sustain his leadership by being present in Parliament. The coming session will be a little bit awkward between now and the end of June and all that. But he needs to get back into Parliament as quickly as possible. Among the things, though, is that if the lowering of the threshold to have all these, I say all these, but who knows how many they will be, these referenda in the province of Alberta on alienation and separation. Now, Pierre Poilievre will be an Alberta resident, and he'll be forced to publicly declare his view on these things and how he's going to vote. In there lies an opportunity, right, to say the right things about Canada and Confederation and the role of the government and what should or shouldn't happen. So that's a good thing. But on the other hand, it may well put him in an awkward spot because Premier Smith is not just talking about the referendum threshold, but there's other stuff that'll put him in a tougher spot. So yeah, I was surprised, but he needs to get his way back into Parliament, and he's created a new challenge for himself. But I'm hopeful that he'll be able to navigate that and do so effectively.
How do you assess the loss by the Conservatives? I mean, there they were for the better part of 2 years, or at least 18 months, cruising to government status as long as Justin Trudeau was there. Then along comes Donald Trump. 51st state. He saw the reaction in Trudeau and so thought that's a button I can push. That's really going to keep working. Galvanize the Canadian people in a different way. Was there, I guess what I'm getting at is given Trump's words and Carney's emergence, was there any way for the Conservatives to win this election?
I think so. Look, we came relatively close. I mean, like it's funny after the election results come in, everybody looks at the numbers. We see the seat count, we see the popular vote count, and all that.
All good.
And then people we have conversations like this. Like you and I have had, you and I are having this conversation now, but you and I each in our own ways have had this conversation a couple hundred times, right? And then eventually, it's sort of a consensus emerges, right? And the consensus I think is pretty bang on, right? That as long as Justin Trudeau was Liberal leader, the Liberals were going nowhere, and Pierre Poilievre was the perfect antidote to Justin Trudeau. A generational shift, a matter-of-fact guy who was plain-spoken and aggressive about fixing the failures of Justin Trudeau, yada, yada. And then Donald Trump comes along, and then Mark Carney comes along, and Mark Carney is he's a counterbalance to not only Donald Trump, but he's a counterbalance to Justin Trudeau because he looks different, sounds different, presents different. His emphasis is different. His resume is different. But he's also very different than Pierre Poilievre. He presents different and all that sort of stuff. And people, because Donald Trump is who he is and what he is, we're forced to look into our phones and hold these little 4-inch screens, 10 inches from our face and stare into our phones and take in all these politicians. And as the kids say, real recognizes real. And you know what you see. You can't fake it. You can't get away with it. And Canadians just made a really stern judgment, and they decided what they. And also the hardcore progressive left. They knew what the assignment was, and which was to stop Pierre Poilievre and all that. And I think some things in the previous Parliament, I think probably might have been done differently in retrospect. Like, did it make a lot of sense to attack and scold and belittle and make fun of Jagmeet Singh in the last Parliament and say he's only in it for his pension, he's just draining out, I remember the 04 to 06 Parliament and the relationship that Stephen Harper built with Jack Layton and sort of explained to him his rational interest and why it made sense to sort of come together and bring down Paul Martin, because there's an opportunity here with sponsorship that the NDP could be a bigger and more aggressive, progressive voice, and we could work with them as Conservatives in government to get some things done that would be accretive to the progressive agenda on democratic reform and accountability and all that. And Jack Layton saw that opportunity. But instead, we were just, a bunch of howitzer cannons just blasting at everybody.
Yeah. In fairness, Jack Layton understood politics. It's not clear.
Well, that's true, right? But it's I don't know that we ever tried with Jagmeet Singh. It doesn't seem to be the case. And just blowing the guy up, caused him to dig in, and they allowed Justin Trudeau to escape his moment of accountability, and then we brought in Mark. So I think that was a mistake. And then in the campaign, and again, it's easy for me to say from the cheap seats, and it's easy for me to say this and all that, and I'm not in there, and the pressures that Pierre is under in order to keep the coalition united. But look, I'm one who believes that Donald Trump is a menace. I think he's a threat. I think he's awful, and I think we should have been more aggressive in our language and reassuring Canadians that we are not him, and we do not recognize his approach to attacking us. And we can't just be anti-Donald Trump when it's popular to be anti-Donald Trump, because he happens to bring in tariffs and all that. I think we have to be consistently clear as Conservatives in Canada that we are pro-free trade, we are pro-free enterprise, we believe in strength and dignity around the world, we believe in standing by our NATO and NORAD partners, we believe in the rule of law internationally, and we believe in standing with Ukraine, and we'd be unapologetic about that. But instead, we've got 10, 20% in certain parts of the country of Conservatives who still like Donald Trump. Because of his presentation, his aggressiveness on certain issues, whether it's immigration or social stuff, and we're worried about offending, a certain small percentage of the Canadian populace who still likes Donald Trump, and so we pull our punches. And Canadians were looking for somebody who is real in this time of crisis, and it's genuinely a crisis if Donald Trump does what he's threatening to do. So, again, from the cheap seats, in retrospect. I think we should have been more assertive, more quickly, and more consistently that Donald Trump is a real threat to Canada.
I've got 2 quick points. I know our time has just gone by, but if I can keep you for 2 more minutes. So the first one, just given your statement earlier about how Canadians reacted in this election, it wasn't because they, lifelong liberals became conservatives or New Democrats flooded to the, Do you think, though, and we've had this discussion a couple of times post the election on this podcast, which is, do you think there's a shift that there's no sense being a New Democrat when you've got the Liberal Party being so left that was going to become a big block of progressives, but maybe Mark Carney's Liberals will be different and the NDP will go back to being the NDP. What do you think on that one? And then I have one more quick question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too soon to tell. One of my favorite
Okay.
one of my favorite quotes in politics was John Quincy Adams,
Yeah.
who he said, "Being all things to all people means being nothing to no one."
Yeah.
And Mark Carney, he's got, he's a former central banker. He's got Tim Hodgson, who's also, he's got François Philippe Champagne at the cabinet table as finance minister. So he's sort of showing a little leg to the pro business center right
Yeah.
community and all that. And then he's got Gregor Robertson at the table and Stephen Guilbeault
Right.
at the table as well in cabinet. Something got to give, and I don't know what that is. Maybe they can get along on 80% of the issues, but that other 20 is going to be tough.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of New Democrat voters lent their votes to Mark Carney because they wanted to stop Pierre Poilievre and confront Donald Trump. In the next election, Donald Trump likely won't be there.
Yeah, he won't be there.
You know what I'm saying? So, like,
Yep,
a lot
absolutely.
of ground will have shifted. My advice to New Democrats, God forbid, anyways, I always say beating liberals is good for the country. Beating New Democrats is just good fun. Like it's just good citizenship. And so, but for New Democrats, like my genuine advice to them would be go slow.
Yeah.
Like choose your like what if. What if New Democrats double down on the hard left progressive stuff and all that, and they continue to box themselves in with sort of mainstream voters, then they're going to be, drawing their own, death sentence. On the other hand, what if they choose a leader that's someone like John Horgan, the late John Horgan, and someone who's pragmatic and plain spoken and who believes in private sector unions and getting tough on crime and being thoughtful and all that. And he draws back a lot of the voters who went conservative. That created a problem for Pierre Poilievre, but it might reestablish them in places like, Thunder Bay and places like Nanaimo and the North Island and, working class suburbs of Vancouver. Like, what if? So we don't know. The Democrats would be wise because they've got nothing now but time on their hands, is to sort of sit back, go slow on the leadership question, wait and see what
they
Mark
are.
Carney offered. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And do all
Yeah.
that. And then that will give them, I think, a bit of a roadmap in terms of what's reasonable for them to move forward with.
Okay, here's the other issue, and I raised it with Sean last week, is with all of the focus on interprovincial trade barriers and what we're seeing from Quebec and from Alberta and all of these issues, are we going to, and this may be a plus for Pierre Poilievre, it may buy him some time, but it looks like we're now having the federal government deal with the provinces rather than the opposition. And is that a short-term thing, or might this be a longer trend?
I think it's essential. You've got internal barriers to trade, breaking them down.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's good. I mean, look, Tim Houston, premier, but he's an interim premier of PEI, Premier Lance, Doug Ford, like they are being as strident as any province has ever been. Alberta under Jason Kenney and Daniel Smith has said very good things. Scott Moe has always been an open book. Like people are saying the right things, but what it requires. I mean, I took a big bite of this when I was industry minister and internal trade. We had some progress, but it was not nearly what could have been and what I'd hoped for. But look, Mark Carney says he's gonna get rid of the federal barriers to internal trade. That's fine, but there are not a lot of those, quite frankly. The big ones are provinces, right? And credential recognition, government procurement, rules and regulations regarding interprovincial transport. Like there are some big issues there that have a lot of built-in and baked-in constituencies who don't want change. The way to unstick all of this is for the prime minister to meet with the premiers and to demand that the premiers take ownership of this. Everybody talks free trade, but when push comes to shove and it comes to, for example, government procurement across the provinces, for example, Fort McMurray burns down. Well, it makes sense for the government of Alberta to want to rebuild Fort McMurray with Fort McMurray businesses providing the work and those carpenters to rebuild the homes and all that, and to give the government contracts and all that. It's pretty hard to argue that, for example, a company from Ontario would airlift into Alberta and take those jobs away from Albertans. So, like, it's easy for people to say, well, we'll just have government procurement open across the country. But there are reasons why they're kind of closed off, because you want to reserve that ability to pump some money into the Fort McMurray economy after the fires and help those local businesses. On the other hand, there's an economic downside. So that forcing premiers to take ownership of it and not lateral this to some deputy minister or a cabinet minister who might talk a good game and then get shut down by their cabinet, forcing ownership by the premiers themselves. And frankly, I think they should televise the conversation. Yeah. We've had constitutional conventions in the past, in the 80s and the 90s, where the premiers and the prime minister sat in a big open room with television cameras on, and people came to the table and they would give a Fort McMurray example about why they don't want to quite do it. And they would come to the table and they would say why they want some exemptions for some key industries. And maybe we can be okay with that. But we can also expose the hypocrisy, and we can also have, a reckoning, because we've been talking about this forever and ever and ever. And we
it was, I mean, I was there covering those constitutional talks, and we had the 11 first ministers at the table and Indigenous representation, but it became, I think, more of that, which is the federal government not Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre yelling at one another, but premiers and a prime minister at a table saying the light's on all of us. We actually have to fix this. Are we as good as our word?
Well, and I think it's fair to say that it was aspirational in the past, but this is now different, right? This is a fundamental need. This is not a want.
Exactly.
Pierre Trudeau wanted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Brian Mulroney wanted to get Meech and Charlottetown done, to get Quebec's signature on the Constitution as he viewed it, and to have his moment that was equal to Pierre Trudeau's. This is not a want. This is a need. We need to get this done. We need to fortify the Canadian economy. We need to protect ourselves from the Americans, and we need to have as much free trade within Canada as we have with the United States, which we don't, which is absurd. And so forcing accountability in a public spotlight, I think, is due.
Yeah, really, really good. Great to talk to you, James. It's always good. I love the way your head works, and we got to think these things through. And thanks for helping all of us do that.
Thank you for your leadership and continued service, Senator. All the best to you.
James Moore. He was a longtime cabinet minister, one of the smart guys around the table. Believe me, I witnessed it, and is now a public policy advisor for Edelman, which is a global firm on this. So we will again talk soon, and thank you all for being with us for this version. Also this week, as I said, we're going to take a look south of the border and what the president's actually up to. So join us for that one too. But for now, James Moore, thank you very much. Thank all of you. We'll see you soon.